Let me begin, and slightly unfairly, Montek, with a question that's not in the book, which is sort of the global context for the 70s and 80s, which to some extent at least provided the backdrop for India. We can keep this brief. In particular, I'm interested in the oil shocks of 1972-73 and 79-80. And you mention it very briefly in the book, the sort of contrast in the approach between China's approach to reforms and India's approach to reform.
I'm glad you touched on the global context because, it's true in all large countries that they tend to ignore the global context. And I think we are also quite legitimately, we can be accused of that. I do touch on it a little bit in the book because I had the advantage during the 1970s of being in the World Bank. And I mean, through the 1960s and the 1970s, anyone looking at India from the outside would have seen that developments outside are not adequately reflected in the thinking inside. I mean, in the sense that, probably in the early 60s, when we first went down the Nehruvian path, big state intervention, etc., actually, what was being done then was very much in line with what was global practice. I mean, in retrospect, people think that he was perhaps unduly oriented towards control, and he was heavily so, because that generation had seen the rise of the Soviet Union as an important industrial power. I think somewhere in the book I mentioned that, the great Paul Samuelson, in an early editions of his book, Economics, sort of accepted the fact that the Soviet Union was growing so much more rapidly than the United States and predicted that Soviet GDP would cross that of the United States sometime around 1984. And in subsequent years, he kept updating that until in 1980, he said, well, the overtaking will be by 2012. But I think by then it had become quite clear that it wasn't going to happen, so he dropped it. So externally, you could see that we were over-controlled. Secondly, I think we were also underperforming. And that became very evident after the mid-1960s when East Asia began its transformation. So for me, coming from the outside, the dominant thing was that, look, we seem to be over-controlled. The interesting thing is, by the way, that it is not only the outsiders who held this view. Even internally, way back in 1959, or actually way back in the second plan, B.R. Shenoy, in his minute of dissent to the second plan, had pointed out that he had objected to too much deficit financing, and that got a lot of attention. But he had also objected to excessive controls, excessive nationalization. He was more a market-oriented guy. And it was around then that Rajaji, for example, broke from the Congress. And, a lot of people don't realize that the term license permit Raj, which was very frequently used in the 1980s to criticize India's excessive controls, actually came from Rajaji. He was the one who said, look, we didn't fight the movement for independence from British Raj in order to succumb to license permit Raj. So even internally, these things were being thought about, but somehow they didn't surface. That frequently happens, and what is important is to tell the history like it is so that we can learn from it. So my feeling when I came back to India in 1979, and I thought, look, we're being held back by a system of controls that's utterly inefficient and which doesn't exist anywhere else in the world. And we need to change that.